This podcast is a product of the Florida Academy of Collaborative Professionals. Nothing in this podcast should be considered legal advice. To find a collaborative professional near you, visit www.collaborativepracticeflorida.com. I'm Catherine Eaton, a collaborative family law attorney and a member of the Florida Academy of Collaborative Professionals. And I'm going to start that again, Eric, since I'm not speaking yet.
Coffee.
I'm Catherine Eaton, a collaborative family law attorney and a member of the Florida Academy of Collaborative Professionals. Today's guest is Marta Alfonso, and she is the current president of the Florida Academy of Collaborative Professionals. Welcome, Marta. Thank you for being our guest today. Besides being the president, I know that you are a financial neutral when you're working in the collaborative process. Will you please share with us your background as a financial neutral and how you became involved in the collaborative process?
Certainly. And Catherine, thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to participate and talk about the collaborative process for all of our members across the state and for those that haven't started but that are curious about the movement. So my background is I am a CPA. I'm also an attorney, but decided to stay on the financial side of things. I'm certified in forensics and business valuation. So part of my practice does do work in the forensic arena for economic damages and things like that. And the other part of my work relates to matrimonial dissolutions. I do some litigation, but I did collaborative, and I started collaborative because of my personal experience in getting divorced. I had two small children, and my divorce was hard. And I'll just leave it there because it just was very difficult. The divorce was difficult. The post-divorce was difficult. And the people that were most affected by that were my children. I think parents are affected by it, and even if people can walk away from it when you have a difficult situation, those issues linger for a long time. So not everybody's meant to stay together forever, unfortunately. I wish that people had that perspective, but that's not how it goes. So if people decide that they have to change the nature of their relationship, it's better to do it in a way that doesn't damage the family unit, because the reality is you're going to be co-parenting for that period of time. So what drove me into the process was the ability to see people, that those that particularly had children, to be able to come out of it with a better relationship. It doesn't mean that it's perfect, but it's better. Similarly, for people that are older and don't have children, they want to part ways, or if they're not parting ways, they want to be able to remain friends. In some cases, which I think is also a good outcome, even though it's not quote unquote a resolution out of the process, people get back together because we teach people in that process how to communicate and how to discuss problems. And so I find the process very, very positive. I would say that most of my close friends are in the collaborative movement, and that happened by more than accident than anything. But I have a lot of good friends that emanated from those associations, so I'm happy with that. That being said, I know that people say, the movement is such that you put blinders on, and the answer is no, you don't. There are certainly cases where you can't use the collaborative process, but if you can, it's really worthwhile. It's just a worthwhile process. So hopefully that answers your question.
That does answer my question. And what I liked hearing was that some of your very good friends are in the collaborative process, and through FACP, or I know you're with the IACP, which is the International Academy of Collaborative Professionals. I think that's where we first met, was even though we're both from
yes, it was.
Florida.
Yes, it was.
But we both met on the international level. And then we said, oh, you're from Florida too. So
that's right.
There's good people that want to help good people and make things better. So would you speak a little bit more about being a financial neutral? And of course, you're an attorney also, but when you're in the collaborative process, what is your role? What are you doing? What is, as I like to say, what is your homework that you do and you take care of while people are going through this difficult situation?
Well, I view my role as one of collecting information, providing education and insight, and providing analysis. I try to help the parties walk through the decisions that they're making. Clearly, not everybody has the same perspective on what's important to them. So understanding what's important to each party is important. Oftentimes you have one party who's totally uninformed. And in that case, that party needs more time to process or to provide information for. Sometimes it's teaching that party how to be financially self-sufficient, which is actually one of the most rewarding things that I've done. I can think of 2 cases that I've worked on where I had one person who was petrified when they walked in the door, petrified that they would be able to make those decisions. And at the end, they articulated everything they wanted. Of course, they negotiated to the solution. And at the end, they wrote a haiku about the experience. I mean, it blew me away. So what it showed that person was that they could stand up on their own and identify what was important. In another one, they had never managed money, never in the entire relationship, because the other person had been in charge of the money, and it was daunting. So at the first meeting, we started with a budget, a cash budget every week, to give that person money to start managing expenses. So we agreed on expenses and money that person could have. And little by little, by the end of the process, it was very great to see that that person had the confidence and had gone and done some of their own analysis work and asked questions. So, it's great to see those changes. Some of that challenge is mixed in the sorrow of a transitioning relationship. And so what's kind of fun is to also understand the emotions that go with money. And so we deal with issues of control, issues of punishment, issues of educating, teaching people how to communicate about things that they may not agree with, but they don't have to hit somebody over the head with. So I link arms a lot with the mental health professional. And I will literally sometimes sit with the party and do a role play. So I will prepare them for the meeting and say, when this person says this, you want to consider answering in a different way. And I'll give you an example. If you want to tell somebody that you totally disagree with their opinion, you can come across and say, that was the most stupid idea that you've had. I think it's dumb. I think it's terrible. And people, when they're angry, the filter goes away. And then, so I said, I want you to look at it this way. When you go to a restaurant and they want to offer you chicken, and you don't want chicken, and you don't want the steak, what do you say to the waiter? You say, wow, those are really interesting choices, but I think I want the fish. And so you don't hit them over the head, and you still say the fish and the chicken. And all of a sudden it hits them what I'm trying to say. So let's apply that to this situation. They want to do X. And you say, I really understand that perspective. And it's important for them to understand that you're hearing it. But now you can say, but I think I really want this. And so it's not a head-on crash, and they can at least hear what you're saying and that you have a voice and an opinion. So, sometimes at the end of conversations, some of the lawyers will laugh and they said, she had the fish. And I'm like, yeah, she did, and it works. So those are the things that, you can use that seem simple, but they're impactful.
That's a great example. I've never heard that before. So thank you. I'm going to take that nugget away with me for
Please.
my next session.
Please.
So what I get commonly when people are first learning about collaborative, or they say, I'm, ready to file, is they look at it very simplistic, saying, we're just going to divide everything in half. And I mean, so what do we need a financial neutral? We're just going to divide it all in half. And then I start giving examples. Well, not everything is so easily divided in half. And maybe one person gets this and one person gets that. Can you speak to that? And it's a little bit of a takeoff on what you were saying on option building, and how dividing everything in half, it sounds easy, but it's not really, it doesn't really work that way.
You're absolutely right, Catherine. You could say 50% and 50, and that's in fact not the way it always works. First, because not every asset is divisible. Number two, oftentimes they don't realize that they're assets that they have that they should identify. Third, a lot of times assets are illiquid. So you may have an asset that you can't sell right away, or that's illiquid and you don't know what you want to do with it. So we begin to build alternatives, and we will put those alternatives on a board. Assets that are valuation sensitive, if you will. And in the state of Florida, they encourage you to value every asset where possible. And the problem with that, of course, is that number one, you don't necessarily want to spend the money.
It's expensive to value. Well, we'll just get an appraisal. Well, that's easy said, but then it starts adding up, doesn't it?
Correct. And as to businesses in particular, that can be more dicey. So, you have to walk through the steps with them so that they can understand the implications and choices. And sometimes we come up with very easy solutions, and sometimes, it's more complicated. So it really depends on the solution. So, for example, one of the ways that we deal with illiquid houses is we have resources that can come in and give them alternative ways to buy out the house or to refinance. Number two is maybe somebody stays in the house for a period of time, and we negotiate rent, etc., for those things. Number three, maybe one person buys it out and they figure out how to do that. So there's many things, or what they want to do is take the house and put it in trust for their children. I mean, there's all kinds of issues. In fact, in some cases, I've been brought in just to lay out all the alternatives. And then people schedule on their own. By the time I'm there, I've been fortunate enough that they don't tell me to go away. They let me finish, the whole thing. But I had one case where parties had decided, oh, we'll divide these easy assets and you take all the difficult ones. And the problem with that is not because they can't divide the easy assets, but because a lot of the easy assets get implicated when you start dealing with the more complex ones. So if you decide you're going to divide the cash that seems simple 50-50, and you have 4 liquid assets, you forget that the complexity of how you're going to divide the cash is based on how you're going to treat those other assets. So what ends up happening is that when people come to the table and have made partial deals, those partial deals limit them in their option building. And so it's not that I want to control those decisions, because all those decisions will be made by them. But ultimately, when you do that, you hamstring yourself in solution building. So, that's the value of having the financial professional participate.
You're so right. One of the hardest cases I had was the parties came in with a partial deal, with a partial agreement. And so one person was very locked in, and the other person is, we don't want to discuss what we've already agreed to. We don't want to waste the time and spend money because we've already agreed. But then when we started to talk about the assets that needed to be divided and how they were going to, what was going to, were they going to sell? Were they going to buy out? All those options you just mentioned, their hands were really tied in the options because we couldn't use the prior agreement they made to facilitate and effectuate that. Can you speak a little bit more in detail? Because we're talking in generalities, and can you speak
So
to our
let's say,
audience
for
as to-
example, I'll
Yes.
try to come up with something simple. Let's say, and I'll make it simple, 3 assets, okay? One for cash for $1 million. You have an investment account for $3 million. And you have a house for $7 million. Okay? So that house right now doesn't have a mortgage on it. So that means you have $10 million worth of assets. If you agree that you're going to divide the first $4 million, I guess it's $4 million, no, $3 million, half and half, million, half a piece. And now you have the $7 million asset, and somebody wants to buy it out. They're not going to have enough money to be able to buy out that asset, be able to live. And, because the way you would have to buy that out is get a mortgage, and you have to put money down. So you're going to have no money to live on. And you have to question whether that decision works that way. Whereas if you put the 10 million in the pot, maybe you can do something a bit different that permits that person to have money. Where, for example, as crazy as it sounds, you give the person that needs the 3 million in the pot, and then you let them go out and refinance the house, and you get 5 million out of the house. I mean, there's all kinds of things you could do where you're able to move the money around, which seems counterintuitive, but what it would end up doing is permit that person to be able to live in the house, have cash, and let the other person totally cash out.
That's a good example.
And you would, like I say, it's counterintuitive.
Because you also do business valuations, and so many people I find in Florida more than other states have their own business, whether it's
Yes.
a family business and a family business they inherited, or the couple started together, or each professional has their own business. I mean, even a law firm or a solo practitioner like myself, that's a business. So would you speak a little bit to when you have businesses and what information and what is needed to figure out the value of a business? And I know that's big, wide, and broad because there's so many different types of businesses, but people forget that their business is an asset. They think, oh, that's mine. And in some ways, sometimes it is theirs because only they can do it. But
Right.
Would you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. So when you have a closely held business, and certainly when there's a personal services business, that business is really your labor and efforts, but there's a cash flow stream associated with that business. So you have to be able to value that cash flow stream. And typically when it's an operating business that is not asset intensive, you're going to use what is called the profit or net income method to weight that the most heavily, because that is really the basis of your activity, as compared to having, let's say, a ton of real estate, and you have a real estate company and it's asset intensive, and then you got to look at the value of the real estate as well as the cash being thrown off by the activity of the real estate. So in the case of the operating companies, there's really 3 levels of potential valuation that you can enter into. And it really is a matter of how precise you want to be. Precision comes with a cost, and it becomes with a debate. The higher precision, the more assumptions get built into that level of precision that as a business valuator, you have to be sensitive to. So the first one is just going out and getting benchmarks, which is the least precise, which is not a valuation or a calculation. It is just getting numbers that say, look, there's some thumbnail numbers and, you know, it's in that range, and it gives you a range. Some people say that's enough, okay? The disadvantage is that that number could be very different than what your actual number is. So I would still recommend that even if you're doing that type of benchmarking, that you normalize, which means that you look at the results of the company and pull out things that others wouldn't pay for, or that people would think are one-time events. And what do I mean by others wouldn't pay for? Well, others wouldn't pay for your wife getting paid out of the company and she's not working in it. Or others wouldn't pay for a boat that you pay for out of the company. So you need to reflect the expenses to operate the business out of your company. The next level is a calculation. And a calculation is different than a valuation because it literally is calculating the values of the business without doing a full report. And you do have certain key operating assumptions that you use when you do that. Things like discount rates, things like considering assumptions with respect to how profitable the company is going to be in the future. And, you know, there can be different points of view on that. So you have to lay out for those individuals what those key issues are so that they can have a discussion. And for the person that may not understand what evaluation is, got to educate them on that. And then finally, there's a full boat valuation, which has a bunch of assumptions again, and it's a full report. As a practical matter, I see very few people going the full boat report. In fact, I see in these very small private businesses, oftentimes, you know, some of them are already defunct, or some of them are really the efforts of what you see on tax returns. So you really try to go through and talk to the parties about the choices. If you do have an asset-intensive business and you got to look at the assets to get the value, then you get back into the issue of how are you going to get to an estimate of fair market value. Some people who know the market well may be able to get something as simple as a market quote, which is not perfect, but it's there. Others will use I tend to try to use a blended method where you're using market quotes, sometimes databases that are public, and try to blend a rate from there. With assets that are not real estate, then you get into, are you going to inventory and value those assets? And it's really a matter of what's the disposition of them at the end. A lot of people don't want to spend the money and the effort to go value or count up, for example, all the art. What they agree to do is, you know, they're happy with the art they have, or they agree to split the art. You pick one, I pick one, or they have a particular artist they like, or they have somebody come in that they know to estimate the value. I mean, there's all kinds of things that can be done. But inevitably, or one of the parties goes out and decides to get quotes off the web. I mean, that's all kinds of homework that, you know, you have those discussions with the individuals and you let them debate it. And ultimately, in this process, as you know, they get to decide how they treat that asset.
That's what I was going to circle back with. That's what's different about this process versus if they were litigating, because just explain a little bit that if they were in the litigation process, what would happen versus what you just described?
Well, clearly in litigation, you are supposed to value all those assets. So you would have to go out and get appraisals. You would have to spend the money on, your art, if silver were significant. And there would oftentimes not only be one appraiser, but if there's not agreement as to one appraiser, they go get two appraisers. So you're paying for double the expense, double the forensic accountant, double sometimes the business valuator. Doing business valuations, in my opinion, are horrible. And it's because, inevitably one person's going to be more positive, another person's going to be more negative. And the negotiation for that value is somewhere in the middle. So, that's the difficulty with that approach.
I'm going to switch gears now, since we have you as a guest and we're talking money, about alimony. And specifically, we always say alimony is based on need and ability to pay. Can you talk a little bit as to what needs are and what ability to pay? We have these generic phrases that we throw out to clients, and they're like, but they don't really understand. Can you put it in terms that people will understand what need and ability to pay is versus just a phrase?
Sure. So the way that Florida looks at things, I guess I would say, is somewhat of a dual, probably triple level of complexity. One is this issue of need, which is really how much are you going to spend on living? And that is a function of where you're going to live, what car do you drive, and what personal expenses do you have. And, there's a balance with, this is what I was spending, and now there's no ability to pay for it, or this is what I was spending and there is an ability to pay. So the need is based on your ability or your lifestyle in spending. And so you'll look at what you're currently spending and you'll evaluate that. In some cases, if for some reason there's been a change in that pattern because of, for example, an illness, or there was a job that you didn't have and now you have it, you take that into account. Then you come to the ability to pay. And the ability to pay, you look at what you're earning or what you could earn. So if you're a person that is not working and could be working, and there are ways to evaluate that. You can bring in somebody vocationally to do that, or you can acknowledge if you can go get a job for X. And that becomes a salary that gets used to value your contribution to your spending. Then in today's world, it's a formulaic process. You look at what the other person is earning. And oftentimes it's a little bit more complex than just my wages. Certainly you have to look at the tax return, and you also have to look at particularly if you have an executive or somebody that is in a company that is giving them stock plans. You've got to take a look at those, where the income's coming from, how it gets valued, et cetera, et cetera. So once you come to those numbers, in today's world, there's a formula. And I'm going to go with the long-term one because it's straightforward, which is, you're going to use the difference between the net income after your taxes, multiply it by 35%, and that becomes a ceiling. So you compare that ceiling to what the net need is between what the person that has the need is earning versus their budget versus the ceiling, if you will, and then decide what the number should be. I think that even in collaborative today, that is pretty much the way that we look at that, although I think there's definitely more flexibility in designing a solution that meets some of the creativity that you're doing. So for example, if you have a need for a significant expense upfront because you need to move, you may be able to accommodate that in the solution. So, but it's a matter of what you need to live. What are you spending to live reasonably? you're not going to be destitute. But on the other hand, if you've never had a Ferrari, you're not going to be able to get the lease for the Ferrari in this deal. Doesn't mean you can't have the Ferrari. You can have the Ferrari, but your spouse doesn't have to pay for that Ferrari. I mean, I've had people that have said, this is my moment. And I'm like, yeah, I mean, I think it's great that you want to live in a, you know, a mansion. You've never lived in one, or you lived in a mansion, but when you split up a household, it can't be afforded. Or, I mean, I've had people that have run into the ground because they believe that their other spouse could accommodate all the spending that they wanted. And what the other spouse said is, I'm about ready to, you know, burst a blood vessel because I can't continue to do this. Or I had one case where the clients were overspending. And it was really hard to sit down with that family and say, you know, you're insolvent. And they looked at me and I said, you know, that has multiple implications here. It doesn't only have the implication for you all having to cut your spending, but it also has an implication for the team, which is, you know, you don't want to create fraudulent conveyances in this process, which makes it a bit more complex on the legal side.
I would say the most difficult collaborative cases I've had are when there's not enough resources and the family, you know, two incomes and they're overspending. And then when you go to divide everything up, they weren't making it together. And then now, how are they going to make it, you know, scales of economy, right? When you have two roofs and two cell phone bills and two car insurance policies and two of everything, those are the most difficult cases to resolve. They can't afford to keep fighting and litigate, but they also making those tough decisions. So I would say that those are the most difficult cases that I've had, is when there's not enough resources.
I find that those cases will not resolve in the meeting where it's first discussed, because one of the two people are often in denial about the problem or weren't aware of the problem because the other spouse was embarrassed to explain it sometimes. Or I've had ones where the second person got angry and overspent out of vengeance or out of ignorance. And so for that other person to accept the fact that their lifestyle is not only going to change because they're splitting, but it's going to go substantially down to be able to accommodate the real life, that can be a very, very difficult processing activity. Sometimes I'll do it separate, but oftentimes I think the delivery of that first message should be together because they need to be able to face that. And I will have that discussion with the team up front. So I'm sure there's some previewing of it with the client, but it's very difficult. So I oftentimes find that the first meeting, what I'm met with is some incredulity, if you will, like, I can't believe this. So they go check it with somebody else, or anger. And it's anger at the situation, anger at the other party because you didn't tell me. And sometimes the other party didn't understand either because they're so busy, you know, living hand to mouth, and the debt is out the roof. And who's going to pay for that? I mean, it's difficult. So yes, you're right. Those are very tough cases, but they are settleable. And sometimes what we is, you know, in one case, I sent people to a credit counseling agency to consolidate their debt and reduce the payments. And it made it not perfect, but much more palatable for them to be able to then see their way through it. And one of them had to make the sacrifice of not having two homes, which was living with the parents and living, and then, you know, doing some nesting because there was no other choice.
Yeah, I had a case where the parties, they got divorced. We went through the collaborative process, but they had one child in college and one child just about to graduate. So for the senior year and to get the child through, they stayed married. They're divorced, but they stayed living in the same house because they knew they couldn't afford two different residences and to keep their child in the same school district and all sorts of things. So they became roommates, and we figured out how to pay the bills as roommates.
Yes, I had a case like that, not because of kids, but because they both loved the house so much they couldn't leave it. So they were roomies, and it was very interesting because if you watched The War of the Roses, the idea of separating the house and who got the kitchen at what time, I mean, we negotiated all that. And it ended up working out very well. That's not something that would happen in a courtroom.
Right.
So and in that case, where what was important to both of them was the ability to be able to be in a house together, in your story, getting their son through high school, divorcing in a more peaceful way ended up, I'm sure, making it a better outcome.
Exactly. If what they decided to do was something that a court, if they had litigated, would never order or even consider.
Correct.
So
correct. And what, from your perspective, if I came to you with a situation where I said, you know, Catherine, I'm noticing that they have a potential tax problem. What would you view my role to be in that instance?
I think that you're just stating a fact. So that's a neutral fact in that. Then of course I would inquire and say, why do you think that? What is it based on? My role is always just to gather more data and information and ask more questions. And instead of taking a stance of no, they don't, or that's not right, or one way or the other, I just want to gather more and more data and information. So I would say why and how much, and is there going to be a problem paying for it? And what are we going to do about it? What are the options?
How is it going to get allocated? And who's going to hold the exposure now, and who holds, let's say they filed tax returns historically, who's going to hold that exposure? We've also asked questions like, do you want to go see an expert to validate the concern? And all those choices.
Yeah.
So, right.
And even when dividing up assets, some of those assets have a tax ramification. So it's not just dividing everything in half. When something has a tax ramification, that needs to be taken into consideration, because because it says $50,000 in an account is not the same thing as $50,000 in a checking account. So
that's right. If you're not dividing those assets equally, and giving them equal weight for each party, then if you're going to use it for cash, and it's a retirement account, for example, then you've got to value it at the net of cash value so that you use cash for cash, which does take into account. I'm sorry.
Yeah. And same with selling a house. If buying the other person out, or if they're just going to sell it and divide the proceeds, that's one thing. But if one person is going to buy the other person out, or maybe they're going to rent it, or whatever they're going to do, those tax issues need to be taken into consideration.
That's correct.
I'm the first one to say I know nothing about taxes.
We will provide those calculations, or sometimes people will bring them from their tax accountant. It's however they want to do it. And we'll look at them and make sure they're correct.
So as we're finishing up our conversation, tell me your favorite thing about the collaborative process.
I have many. The best thing is that the people into the collaborative process that oftentimes are not communicating, leave the collaborative process being able to talk to each other in a more constructive way. I've had very few collaborative cases that have settled, that have not walked out that way. In fact, all of them, trying to think about all the ones that have settled, people have walked out that way. Ones that have not settled, that have stayed married, that tells you something. And then the ones that haven't made it through, which when you look at the statistics is probably 10%, which is really very low as compared to even fighting in divorce, which eventually you get there, so you still have that event, is because there was a transparency issue. And
Meaning
what I mean
somebody wasn't showing all their financial, or there was concerns as to.
Right. I've had them terminate because of that. And I've also had them terminate because one party couldn't meet other parties' expectations about liquidity. And that it was a very complex set of issues around liquidity, because historically there had been issues with concerns about meeting obligations. So, it's a trust issue. So, when you're dealing with transparency and trust, those are fundamental parts of this process that even if there are problems at the beginning, if you can establish the right toll gates and what I'll call bumper cars and protections in the agreement, then you're able to create the trust and the guardrails that are needed to accommodate the person with I'm going to say the concern or the anxiety. But you do really have to have the ability to know what I call what the fingers and toes are. Oftentimes, people try to play creative, and, sometimes you can't compensate for that. And the true great collaborative professionals will know when it's time to fold the tent. Yeah. When that happens. And that's one of the reasons that I respect the process, is you have people that by and large, most people in the process have high integrity. And that's what makes the collaborative sandbox safe, because you have a group of people working it, and we're all there to make the settlement happen, and to do it in a way that preserves the relationship. And that is exceptional. And I don't bash the judiciary system at all, but the system is not designed for that. And so it's a different way to solve a problem.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's not designed for families. Yeah.
Right. It's not designed for families, and it's designed to create an adversary situation because you don't have transparency and you don't have trust. And because of that, it's needed. I mean, there are cases where those types of skill sets are needed, but with that, you end up having a series of other disadvantages: length of time, cost, and also somebody who is a judge who is, trying to do his or her best, overwhelmed, and cannot take the time to know you personally, your family, and makes decisions based on what the law is and also what they think the best thing is for your family. And that feels hard because they don't know your family.
As the president of the FACP and also being involved in IACP, can you just speak a little to how the collaborative process is growing in Florida and around the world, and that that even if people are just hearing about it for the first time, how it's been around a while, and how many
Well,
professionals are involved, and how
there are
it
there
really
are
is a big
thousands, there
group.
are thousands of people around the world. You have close to, I would say it's about, I'm rounding to 600 professionals. It's somewhere between the 550 to 600, depending on a given day, professionals that are part of the practice groups and movement in the state. And we are continuing to make progress in growing the practice. It is a practice that is finally been recognized by the American Bar, which is wonderful. We have presence on the Supreme Court website. We had this year an amazing conference 2 weeks ago where we had a panel of 5 judges asking us to do more, help them more. How do we get, and this are judges primarily from the southeast and central part of Florida, how do we get you guys involved to intervene earlier and help us not have this backlog of cases and help these families with a better outcome? So I was so encouraged and so excited from that process, that I feel, and we're trying to work on more education for the judiciary, more education for lawyers that haven't been involved, because even if you decide it's not for me, you still have an obligation to talk to your client about the alternative. And so, getting people educated and making people aware of that choice also impacts the work that we do and the people that come in and ask for it, and allows them to have that as a choice.
Thank you. Thank you for being a guest today. We appreciate
Thank you so
your
much,
time.
Catherine. You're an amazing practitioner. Thank you
Oh,
for
thank
all
you.
you've done for the IACP and the FACP. I am humbled sitting in this chair because there's so many wonderful practitioners across the state. And what you're doing by having this podcast helps us get out to more people. And that's what we need to do. So I'm really grateful for your investment and time.
Oh, thank you, Marta. I appreciate that. And I appreciate you being the leader that you are with the FACP. You're really making a difference. So thank you.
Well, thank you. Have a good day.